When salt corrodes the masks, only the raw truth of nerves remains. Can one find steady ground in the person who was once their greatest fear, while the storm erodes the lines between enmity and a fatal magnetic pull? We are about to hear this story right now. The carriage ride from the station to the Cornish coast was a study in pressurized silence. The further the weathered black coach pulled away from the bustling tracks, the more the air seemed to thicken with the scent of salt and ancient brine-soaked stone. Inside, the rhythmic swaying of the carriage offered no comfort. It only served to highlight the jagged distance between the two figures seated across from one another. Hermione Granger kept her gaze fixed on the window, though the glass was so clouded with sea mist that the landscape was merely a smudge of bruised purples and greys. She could feel the weight of Draco Malfoy's presence like a physical atmospheric pressure. He was a shadow in the corner, his silhouette sharp against the velvet upholstery. He hadn't spoken since they were assigned to the same transport, a ministry-mandated proximity that felt less like reintegration and more like a slow-burning interrogation of her patience. She adjusted her scarf, her fingers fluttering briefly to the edge of her wool sleeve to tuck away a stray thread. It was a nervous habit she loathed, a betrayal of the composed exterior she had spent years perfecting. Across from her, Draco remained unnervingly still. The only sign of life was the rhythmic, almost mechanical tapping of one long finger against the silver head of his cane. A new addition since the trials, a crutch that looked more like a weapon than a necessity. His knuckles were white, the skin stretched thin over the bone, suggesting a grip so tight it might snap the wood beneath. The ministry has a cruel sense of irony, he said suddenly. His voice was a low rasp, cutting through the sound of the wind. Retreat, Malfoy, not a sentence. For retreat, Malfoy, not a sentence. For you, perhaps, he replied, and she could hear the faint, bitter curve of a smile in his tone. For me, being trapped on a cliffside with the Golden Girl feels remarkably like a calculated haunting. She finally looked at him. The dim light of the carriage lamps caught the sharp angles of his face, the hollows beneath his cheekbones that spoke of sleepless nights and a diet of ghosts. He looked fragile, yet dangerous, like a piece of glass that had been shattered and glued back together with jagged edges. I am not haunting you, she said, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. I am trying to finish my NEWTS. If you could manage to be something other than a martyr for 5 minutes, we might actually get through this without a disaster. He turned his head toward her then, his grey eyes catching the light. There was a flicker there, not of anger, but of a desperate, frantic exhaustion. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw the raw nerves beneath. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, he shuttered it. He looked away, his jaw tightening until a muscle pulsed in his cheek. The carriage jolted as the wheels hit a particularly deep rut in the coastal road. The impact threw Hermione forward, her shoulder momentarily jolting against his. The contact was brief, a mere second of visceral alignment, but it felt like a static discharge. She could feel the cold dampness of his cloak and the radiating heat of his body, a startling reminder that he was made of flesh and blood, not just spite and history. She pulled back instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Draco didn't move to help her. nor did he recoil. He simply froze, his breath hitching in a way that was almost imperceptible. "Careful, Granger," he murmured, his voice now barely a whisper. "Wouldn't want to get any of the gloom on your pristine robes." "I'm not afraid of the gloom, Draco," she snapped, using his name for the first time in months. The word felt heavy in her mouth, like a stone. He flinched. It was a small movement, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, but it was enough to tell her she had pierced the armor. Silence reclaimed the carriage, heavier than before, filled with the things they couldn't say and the history they couldn't burn. By the time the carriage pulled up to the manor, a towering skeletal structure of grey granite perched on the very edge of the Atlantic, the sun had fully vanished. The house looked less like a residence and more like a tombstone marking the end of the world. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in a fine, relentless spray that blurred the line between the sky and the sea. As they step out, the wind tore at Hermione's hair, whipping curls across her face. She struggled with her trunk, the heavy wood resisting her tired charms. Draco stood a few feet away, his cloak billowing around him like smoke. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, his hand tightening on his cane until his fingers shook. He took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her as she bent over her luggage. For a heartbeat, she thought he might reach out, that he might offer some semblance of the civility the ministry preached. His hand actually lifted, a pale ghost of a gesture in the dark. Then he stopped. His eyes swept over her, taking in her wind-flushed cheeks and the stubborn set of her jaw. His expression curdled into something cold and distant, a calculated withdrawal. "Do try not to drown on the first night," he said, his voice as sharp as the spray of the sea. "It would be terribly inconvenient for my grade." Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode toward the heavy oak doors of the manor, his limp more pronounced in the uneven mud. He didn't look back. Hermione stood alone in the rain, the roar of the tide filling her ears. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer vibrating tension he left in his wake. She looked down at the mud-splattered hem of her robes and felt a sudden, terrifying sense of vertigo. This wasn't just a trip to the sea. It was a descent into a territory where her logic held no sway, and the man who hated her most held the only map. She gripped the handle of her trunk, the cold metal biting into her palm, and followed him into the dark. The interior of Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of weeping stone and draughty corridors that smelled of ozone and ancient, rotting seaweed. It was a house designed to make one feel small, an architectural shrug against the vastness of the Atlantic. Hermione found herself assigned to a room in the West Wing, where the windows rattled with every rhythmic thud of the tide against the cliffs below. The sound was visceral, a pulse that seemed to sync with the frantic thrumming in her own veins. The ministry's curriculum for the retreat was relentless. By the second morning, the Maritime Magic Project had officially begun. Professor Flitwick had paired them with a cheerful disregard for the simmering war in the room, placing Hermione and Draco in the subterranean archives, a room carved directly into the cliffside. The air in the archives was frigid, tasting of salt and old ink. Hermione sat at a heavy oak table, the surface scarred by centuries of quill marks. Across from her, Draco was a study in rigid withdrawal. He had reclaimed his silence, wearing it like a suit of armor that had been polished until it blinded. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, his grey eyes fixed on a crumbling chart of lunar tides. "We need to categorize the properties of the drowned glass," Hermione said, her voice echoing too loudly in the vaulted space. She reached for a vial of iridescent shards they had collected from the shoreline earlier that morning. Draco's hand shot out, his fingers hovering just inches from hers, stopping her movement without touching her. The suddenness of it made the air between them vibrate. "Don't," he commanded, his voice a low friction against the silence. "The salt hasn't been neutralized. Unless you're particularly fond of losing the skin on your palms, I suggest you use the silver tongs." Hermione bristled, the heat of a defensive retort rising to her cheeks. "I am perfectly aware of the caustic nature of raw sea glass, Malfoy." "Are you?" He finally met her eyes, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. "Because you seem remarkably keen on rushing into things that burn." The subtext was a jagged blade. He wasn't talking about the glass. He was talking about the war, about the trials, about the way she had stood in the Wizengamot and testified for a boy who had once called her a slur with the same breath he used to plead for his life. Hermione's fingers curled into her palms, her nails biting into the soft skin. "I do what is necessary. It's called a conscience. You might find the concept unfamiliar, but it's quite effective for sleep." Draco flinched as if she had physically struck him. The silver ring on his finger caught the flickering candlelight as his hand retreated, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. For a second, the mask of the haughty aristocrat cracked, revealing a hollowed-out exhaustion that made her breath hitch. He looked like a man drowning in dry land. "Sleep," he repeated, a ghost of a laugh escaping his throat. It was a jagged, ugly sound. "A charming sentiment, Granger, truly." He reached for the tongs himself, his movements slow and deliberate. As he transferred the glass shards into a lead-lined basin, Hermione watched the way the light played over the sharp line of his jaw. He was thinner than he had been at Hogwarts, his features sharpened by a gravity she couldn't name. There was a smudge of ink on his thumb, a tiny human imperfection that made the distance between them feel suddenly terrifyingly bridgeable. "The resonance is off," he muttered, leaning closer to the basin. "The tide isn't just a physical force here. It's an anchor for the Manor's wards. Look at the way the light refracts." Despite herself, Hermione leaned in. As their heads drew closer over the shimmering glass, the static between them intensified. It wasn't the sparks of a spell. It was the magnetic pull of two celestial bodies trapped in a failing orbit. She could smell him now. Mint, expensive parchment, and the cold, sharp scent of the winter sea. "If we align the lunar phase with the salt density," she began, her voice trailing off as she realized how close he was. Draco turned his head. His breath fanned across her cheek, a warm contrast to the freezing archive air. The silence became heavy, a thick, pressurized veil that made it hard to breathe. His eyes searched hers, moving from her brow to her mouth with a slow, agonizing scrutiny. For a heartbeat, the "can't stand it" shifted into "can't help but think," a treacherous curiosity that made her pulse leap against her throat. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to plummet. Hermione felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her hands fluttering uselessly at her wrists. The vulnerability in his expression was a raw, open wound, and for the first time she saw not the enemy, but the wreckage. Then the manor's bell tolled for the evening meal, the sound booming through the stone walls like a cannon shot. The spell snapped. Draco recoiled as if burned, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden biting frost. "I can finish the calculations alone," he said, his voice now clipped and professional, the armour slammed back into place. "I'm sure Potter and Weasley are wondering where their moral compass has wandered off to." The dismissal was a cold splash of seawater. Hermione stood, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. "Fine. If you prefer to wallow in the dark, Malfoy, be my guest." She gathered her books with trembling hands, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She hated the way he could flip the switch, the way he could draw her into the orbit of his brokenness and then hurl her away with a sneer. "I don't wallow," he said to the wall, his back turned to her. "I survive. There's a difference." Hermione didn't answer. She hurried toward the heavy iron door, her footsteps echoing hollowly in the vacant corridor. She didn't stop until she reached the spiral staircase, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached up to touch her cheek, where his breath had lingered only moments before. The skin was cold, but beneath it she felt a lingering heat, a friction that refused to fade. She told herself it was anger. She told herself it was the lingering residue of the sea glass's magic. But as she looked out a narrow arrow-slit window at the churning black water below, she knew she was lying. The retreat was supposed to be about reintegration, about healing the fractures of the wizarding world. But as she watched the spray fly against the glass, Hermione realized that some fractures weren't meant to be healed. They were meant to be felt, jagged and sharp, until the pain became the only thing that felt real. She spent the evening in the common room, surrounded by the warmth of a roaring fire and the familiar banter of Ron and Harry, yet she felt utterly isolated. Her mind kept drifting back to the archives, to the smudge of ink on a pale thumb, and the way a broken boy looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking back. Later that night, the storm intensified. Hermione lay in her bed, listening to the house groan under the weight of the gale. A sudden, sharp crack, like the sound of a wand snapping, echoed from the direction of the cliffs. Driven by an impulse she didn't want to analyze, she threw on her robe and slipped out into the hall. The manor was a graveyard of shadows, the candlelight flickering low in their sconces. She found herself walking toward the west wing balcony, the one that overlooked the jagged descent to the beach. There, silhouetted against the white foam of the crashing waves, stood Draco. He wasn't wearing a cloak. The wind whipped his white shirt against his frame, making him look like a ghost caught between worlds. He was leaning over the stone railing, his hands white-knuckled as they gripped the cold granite. He looked as if he were contemplating the fall. "Malfoy?" she whispered, the wind nearly stealing the sound. He didn't turn, but his shoulders slumped, the tension leaving him in a sudden, violent rush. "Go away, Granger," he choked out, his voice thick with a saltier moisture than the sea. "The play is over for tonight." Hermione took a step forward, the cold stone biting into her bare feet. The emotional seesaw tipped once more, the warmth of concern overriding the cold of his earlier dismissal. She saw the way his fingers were trembling, the way his breath was coming in ragged, uneven gasps. "You're going to catch pneumonia," she said softly, reaching out a hand, then hesitating. "Better that than the alternative," he muttered, finally turning to face her. His face was wet with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his eyes that stopped her, wide, haunted, and filled with a raw, unadulterated terror that no pure-blood mask could hide. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of water. The silence that stretched between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the roar of the ocean and the crushing weight of everything they had survived. For a moment, the friction was gone, replaced by a terrifying, silent understanding. Then, Draco blinked, the silver light of a lightning flash illuminating the sudden, harsh return of his resolve. He straightened his spine, the coldness returning to his gaze like a shutter closing. "Get some sleep, Hermione," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tomorrow is another day of pretending we aren't both ruined." He brushed past her, his sleeve damp against her arm, leaving her alone with the storm. The third day at Blackwood Manor arrived with a sky the colour of a fresh bruise. The storm had retreated into a surly, low-hanging mist that clung to the jagged cliffs like a damp shroud. Inside the manor, the air felt thick, charged with the residual static of the previous night's encounter on the balcony. Hermione found herself tracing the grain of the library table, her mind refusing to settle on the arithmancy charts spread before her. Every time the heavy oak door creaked, her breath hitched, a traitorous physical reaction she catalogued with growing frustration. Draco did not appear for breakfast. He did not appear for the morning lecture on coastal ley lines. It wasn't until the afternoon, when the shadows began to stretch long and distorted across the stone floors, that he slumped into the seat beside her in the damp heat of the greenhouse. He looked haggard. The sharp line of his jaw was shadowed by silver stubble, and the collar of his shirt was uncharacteristically frayed at the edge. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he reached for a specimen of lunar-touched kelp, his movements stiff, as if his joints were made of rusted iron. "You missed the briefing," Hermione said, her voice intentionally clipped to mask the tremor of concern that threatened to soften her resolve. "I trust your impeccable note-taking remained untarnished by my absence, Granger," he replied. The old bite was there, but the venom was diluted, replaced by a hollow metallic fatigue. He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the kelp, his long fingers dissecting the translucent leaves with a precision that bordered on obsessive. "Professor Flitwick was asking. He's worried about the cohesion of the pairs." Draco's hand stilled. A small, jagged piece of the plant fell to the table. "Cohesion," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "A poetic term for shackling the disgraced to the righteous. I'm surprised you haven't requested a transfer to Longbottom yet. I hear he's quite the prodigy with things that grow in the dark." Hermione felt the familiar spark of irritation, but beneath it there was a new, sharper ache. "I don't want a transfer, Malfoy. I want you to do your part of the research without acting like every moment in my presence is a slow death by drowning." He finally turned his head. The proximity in the cramped greenhouse was suffocating. The scent of damp earth and blooming nightshades swirled between them. His eyes were bloodshot, the grey depths clouded by a turbulent, unspoken grief. "Maybe it is," he whispered. The admission was so quiet she almost missed it over the rhythmic patter of mist against the glass roof. "Maybe being near you is the only thing that reminds me I'm still breathing, and frankly, Granger, the sensation is overrated." The air in her lungs seemed to vanish. The magnetic pull she had been fighting intensified, a visceral alignment of their mutual wreckage. She saw the way his throat worked as he swallowed, the way his gaze flickered down to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. Before she could respond, he recoiled. "The samples are prepared," he said, his. "The samples are prepared," he said, his voice regaining its icy aristocratic distance. "I'll be in the laboratory. Don't follow me. I work better without the weight of your pity." He vanished into the mist of the corridor, leaving her with the scent of ozone and the lingering vibration of his words. The emotional seesaw swung violently back toward coldness. Hermione spent the next hour in a state of simmering fury. How dare he? How dare he bleed in front of her and then punish her for seeing the wound? She gathered her things with jerky, violent movements, the tooth of the old parchment catching against her skin. By the time night fell, the mist had turned into a steady, freezing rain. The Maritime Magic Project required a midnight observation of the tide's retreat from the cavernous mouth of the Devil's Throat, a natural sea cave at the base of the cliffs. Hermione dressed in her thickest cloak, her boots echoing hollowly as she descended the winding stone stairs. She found him already there, standing at the edge of the surf where the water hissed against the black shingle. The moon was a pale, fractured bone behind the clouds. "The resonance is peaking," he said, not turning as she approached. He was holding a glass sphere that pulsed with a rhythmic, bioluminescent blue light. Hermione stood beside him, the wind whipping her hair into a tangled mess. The tension between them was no longer sharp. It was heavy, like the atmospheric pressure before a cataclysm. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the black water churn. "My mother used to tell me the sea doesn't keep secrets," Draco said suddenly. His voice was stripped of its armor, sounding younger, more vulnerable. "She said it just grinds them down until they're nothing but sand. I used to believe that. Now, I think the sea just waits for you to get tired enough to let go." He looked at the glass sphere, his reflection distorted in its curved surface. "I'm very tired, Hermione." She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm. This time, she didn't hesitate. She let her fingers rest against the heavy wool of his sleeve. Through the fabric, she could feel the frantic, uneven rhythm of his heart. "You don't have to let go," she said softly. "You just have to stand still long enough for the tide to go out." Draco turned toward her. The blue light of the sphere cast deep shadows across his face, making him look like a figure from an ancient, tragic myth. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then slowly, as if moving through deep water, he covered her hand with his own. His skin was freezing, yet the contact felt like a brand. The tactile friction was gone, replaced by a desperate, grounding heat. For a moment, the war, the blood, and the names they had called each other vanished. There was only the roar of the ocean and the white-knuckle grip of two people trying not to be swept away. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching hers. She could feel the tremor in his frame, a vibration of pure, unadulterated need. "Why are you here?" he breathed, his eyes searching hers with a terrifying intensity. "Why aren't you with them? Why are you wasting your light on a ghost?" "Because the ghost is the only one who actually sees me," she whispered, her voice breaking. The distance between them was measured in heartbeats. The "can't help but think" had become a physical ache, a magnetic pull so strong it felt like it might tear her apart. Draco's hand moved from her hand to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her eyes sting. Just as his lips began to descend, just as the warmth threatened to become a fire, a sharp green light flared from the top of the cliffs. The ministry signal, the curfew. Draco froze. "They're watching," he spat, his voice. "They're watching," he spat, his voice turning viciously cold. "Always watching for the slip, aren't they? For the moment the Malfoy heir tries to steal something else that doesn't belong to him." "Draco, no. Go back to the house, Granger," he commanded, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. "The experiment is over. Don't mistake a moment of weakness for a change in the weather. You're still a ministry pet, and I'm still the monster in the cellar. Let's not pretend otherwise." He turned and strode into the darkness of the cave, the blue light of the sphere extinguishing as he went. Hermione stood alone on the black shingle, the freezing rain soaking through her cloak. The cold was absolute. The trust she had felt budding only moments ago was crushed beneath the weight of his betrayal, a betrayal of himself as much as her. She walked back to the manor, her footsteps heavy in the mud. Each step felt like a farewell. She had seen the man behind the mask, and he had punished her for it. As she climbed back to her room, she realized the true danger of the sea wasn't the drowning. It was the way it made you believe you could swim before pulling you under for good. She closed her door and leaned against the wood, her breath hitching in the silent dark. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. But as the tide roared outside her window, she knew the emotional seesaw had only just begun its most dangerous descent. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was a skeletal imitation of Hogwarts. Its vaulted ceiling didn't reflect the sky. Instead, it was trapped in a permanent, enchanted gloom of swirling grey mist. On the fourth morning, the atmospheric pressure inside the room was heavy enough to make the candles flicker with a frantic, dying energy. Hermione sat at the long trestle table, her fingers tracing the rough tooth of the old parchment before her. She was meticulously cataloguing the spectral properties of the sea foam they had bottled, her quills scratching a rhythmic, aggressive sound against the silence. Across from her, Draco was a phantom of his former self. He hadn't spoken a word since the previous night at the Devil's Throat. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, a posture of pure, unadulterated defiance. He was nursing a cup of black tea that had long since gone cold, his silver ring clicking rhythmically against the porcelain. Every click felt like a needle pricking at Hermione's frayed nerves. "If you're going to vibrate with indignation all morning, Malfoy, perhaps you could do it in the owlery," she said, not looking up from her notes. Her voice was steady, but she had to grip her quill so hard her knuckles turned a bloodless white. Draco's hand stilled. The clicking stopped, leaving a silence so sudden it felt like a physical impact. I wasn't aware my existence required your permission, Granger. A common misconception among the victors, I suppose. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were rimmed with a scorched red, the grey irises looking like cooling ash. The cold between them was absolute, a wall of ice built from the bricks of his withdrawal. He looked at her, not with the raw vulnerability of the sea cave, but with a calculated, surgical detachment that made her stomach twist. "Don't do that," she whispered, her resolve slipping for a fraction of a second. "Don't pretend last night didn't happen. You touched my hand. You looked at me as if I was starving," he interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "A common symptom of being caged, wouldn't you say? One reaches for whatever light is closest, regardless of how blinding it might be." The betrayal of his words stung more than any hex. He was dismissing their shared moment as a mere biological reflex, a desperate grab for warmth by a dying man. Hermione felt the heat of a blush crawl up her neck, born of both shame and a burgeoning righteous fury. "I am not a convenience for your emotional crises," she snapped, finally meeting his gaze. "If you want to play the tragic, misunderstood villain, find someone who hasn't seen you cry." Draco's jaw tightened until a muscle pulsed violently in his cheek. He leaned forward, the scent of mint and ozone suddenly overwhelming the smell of the damp hall. "I didn't cry," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "And I don't need your salvation. I need you to finish this project so I can go back to being a shadow and you can go back to being a saint. This interference, it's a mistake, a visceral misalignment of our common sense." He stood up, his chair jarring harshly against the stone floor. He didn't look back as he strode toward the laboratory, his limp slight but noticeable, a lingering echo of the war he carried in his very bones. Hermione sat alone, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her sleeves, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her cuffs until the thread nearly snapped. She was losing her grip on the logic that had always been her anchor. The magnetic pull of Draco Malfoy was dragging her into a territory where her principles were useless. The afternoon brought a shift in the weather. The rain turned into a heavy, suffocating fog that erased the horizon. Professor Flitwick announced that the pairs were to conduct a vibration analysis on the Manor's outer wards, which were anchored to the salt-crusted stones of the West Pier. When Hermione reached the pier, Draco was already there. He was standing at the very edge, where the black waves threw up a fine, stinging spray. He was holding his wand, the tip glowing with a pale, sickly light as he traced the invisible runes in the air. The tension between them was no longer a wall. It was a living thing, a tremor in the very air. They worked in a silence that was thick with the atmospheric pressure of their unspoken words. Every time their robes brushed, or their hands nearly met over a censer stone, the static was so intense it made the hair on Hermione's arms stand up. "The ward is fracturing here," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the tide. She pointed to a jagged crack in the granite, where the sea salt had eaten away the protective enchantments. Draco moved closer to inspect the damage. He was so close, she could feel the radiating heat of his body, a startling contrast to the freezing fog. He didn't pull away this time. Instead, he leaned down, his shoulder brushing hers with a deliberate, slow friction. "It's It's not just the salt, he murmured, his voice losing its jagged edge. The magic is being pulled inward. The manor is feeding on its own foundations. He looked at her, and the warmth returned with the force of a tidal wave. The coldness of the morning was gone, replaced by a desperate magnetic curiosity. His gaze lingered on her mouth, and Hermione felt a sudden, terrifying sense of vertigo. She wasn't falling into the sea. She was falling into the grey of his eyes. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "I push you away. I insult you. I treat you like a ghost. Why don't you just leave me to drown?" Hermione felt the can't help but think bloom in her chest, a traitorous, beautiful ache. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch from the silver ring on his hand. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped in a story you didn't write for yourself," she said softly. Draco froze. The tactile friction as his hand finally moved to cover hers was no longer a shock. It was a surrender. His fingers were trembling, a faint, rhythmic tremor that spoke of 1,000 unspoken fears. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, his grip so tight it felt as though he were trying to merge their skin together. "Hermione," he breathed, her name sounding like a prayer and a curse all at once. He leaned in, his breath fanning across her lips. The approach was slow, agonizingly deliberate. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the smudge of ink on his thumb, the way his eyelashes were beaded with sea mist. The world narrowed down to the space between their mouths, a vacuum of sound and light. Just as the first threshold was about to be crossed, a sudden, violent crack echoed from the cliffs. A section of the pier groaned, the stone beneath their feet shuddering as a massive wave slammed into the foundation. The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco jerked his hand away, his face pale with a sudden renewed terror. He looked at the churning water, then back at her, his eyes wide and haunted. "We can't," he choked out, his voice cracking. "The foundations, they're already ruined. I'm already ruined. Don't you see? Everything I touch eventually breaks." "Draco, wait." But he was already moving, retreating into the fog like a ghost returning to its grave. He didn't look back, leaving her standing on the trembling pier, the sound of the ocean filling the hollow space where her heart had been only a moment before. Hermione stood in the mist, her fingers still tingling from the pressure of his. The emotional seesaw had swung again, from the warmth of a near kiss to the absolute zero of his self-loathing. She looked down at the fracturing stone beneath her feet and realized that Draco was right about one thing. The foundations were rotting. But it wasn't the manor she was worried about anymore. It was the fragile, terrifying thing that was growing between them, a flower blooming in the middle of a salt storm, destined to be crushed before it could ever fully open. She walked back to the manor, her footsteps heavy and slow. Each step felt like a betrayal of her own common sense. She was a girl of logic, of books, of clear-cut paths. Yet here she was, wandering in a fog of her own making, chasing a boy who was more shadow than man. As she entered the great hall, the candles had all burned out, leaving the room in a cold, grey twilight. She looked toward the stairs leading to the east wing, where Draco had vanished, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. Was she trying to save him, or was she just looking for someone to be lost with? The tide continued its relentless roar outside, a sound that promised no peace, only the slow, grinding reality of the sea. The fifth day arrived with a treacherous silence. The wind had finally died down, leaving the manor encased in a thick, wool-like fog that swallowed the sound of the waves. It was the kind of stillness that forced one to hear the echo of their own thoughts, and for Hermione, those thoughts were a cacophony of Draco Malfoy. She found him in the library late that evening, the only room in the house that seemed to retain any heat. The walls were lined with thousands of water-damaged grimoires, their leather bindings yielding a scent of salt and decay that Hermione had begun to associate with the very essence of him. He was seated by a small, sputtering fire, a single candle casting long, flickering shadows across his face. He didn't look up when she entered. He was staring into the flames, his hands folded neatly in his lap, the silver ring on his finger reflecting a dull orange glow. The cold of the previous day on the pier seemed to have settled into a weary, fragile truce. "The resonance charts are finished," Hermione said softly, sliding into the chair opposite him. She didn't push him. She didn't mention the pier or the way he had fled from her touch. She simply existed in the space beside him, a steady presence against his erratic withdrawals. Draco finally shifted his gaze from the fire to her. His eyes looked softer in the candlelight, the harsh edges of his defensive mask blunted by the gloom. "I checked your arithmancy," he murmured. "There was an error in the third decimal on the salt density calculation. I fixed it." Hermione felt a small, unexpected spark of warmth. "You fixed my math? I suppose I should be insulted." "You should be grateful," he countered, though there was no malice in his tone. "The margin for error in maritime magic is razor thin. One misplaced digit and the ward doesn't just fail, it implodes." He reached for a small silver flask on the table, unscrewing the cap and taking a measured sip. He paused, then held it out to her. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a quiet, non-verbal offering of trust. Hermione took it, her fingers brushing his as the metal changed hands. The tactile friction was muted now, replaced by a low-frequency hum of shared exhaustion. The liquid was tea, spiked with something sharp and herbal that warmed her throat instantly. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. For the next hour they worked in a silence that was almost comfortable. They shared a single inkwell, their quills dipping in and out of the dark liquid in a rhythmic domestic dance. It was a false truce, a temporary bridge built over the chasm of their history. Hermione found herself watching him, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he worried his lower lip when he was stuck on a difficult translation. He looked human. He looked like the boy he might have been if the world hadn't demanded he be a soldier. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked, not looking up from his parchment. "Like what?" "Like I'm a specimen," he said, finally raising his eyes. "Like you're trying to solve me, Granger. I'm not a riddle in a book. There is no hidden meaning at the end of the chapter." "I don't think you're a riddle," she replied, her voice steady. "I think you're a person who has spent so long hiding that you've forgotten what it feels like to be seen." Draco's expression tightened. The warmth of the fire seemed to vanish, replaced by a sudden biting draft. He set his quill down, the feather trembling slightly in his grip. "Being seen is a liability. It gives people a target." He stood up, pacing the small circle of light. You think this quiet moment changes anything. You think because we can sit in a room without trying to ruin each other, the foundations are suddenly solid. Look at me, Hermione. He stepped closer to the candle, and with a sudden, violent movement, he yanked back his left sleeve. The dark mark was a jagged, ugly stain against his pale skin, the ink looking bloated and grey in the flickering light. He didn't look at it with pride. He looked at it with a visceral, silent loathing. "This is the reality," he hissed, his voice cracking. "This is the rot you keep trying to ignore. You're the brightest witch of our age, and I'm a marked coward. There is no alignment for us. There is only the tide coming in and the tide going out." Hermione stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't recoil. Instead, she took a step toward him, her hand reaching out to the scarred skin of his forearm. Draco flinched, a tremor running through his entire frame, but he didn't pull away. "I see the mark, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I also see the hand that's shaking while you show it to me. One was forced on you. The other is who you are now. Which one do you think matters more?" The magnetic pull was back, stronger and more agonizing than before. She let her thumb graze the edge of the mark, her touch light, almost reverent. Draco let out a jagged, broken breath, his head dropping as he leaned into her space. The atmospheric pressure in the library reached a peaking point. "You're a fool," he whispered, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "A brilliant, stubborn, beautiful fool." The warmth was overwhelming now, a fire that had nothing to do with the hearth. Hermione could feel the static between them, the visceral alignment of their two broken histories. She closed her eyes, waiting for the approach. For the moment, the seesaw would finally tip into the first kiss. But then, the library door creaked open. A gust of cold air from the corridor flooded the room, and the candle sputtered out, plunging them into sudden absolute darkness. "Malfoy, Granger, Professor Flitwick wants the final reports." It was Neville's voice, hesitant and distant from the doorway. The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco practically shoved her away, the sound of his sleeve being yanked back down, echoing in the dark. By the time the lights flickered back on, he was already at the other end of the room, his back to her, his posture rigid and cold. "Tell him they're on the table, Longbottom," Draco called out, his voice perfectly controlled, his aristocratic mask firmly back in place. He didn't look at Hermione again. He gathered his things with a frantic, jerky efficiency and vanished into the shadows of the stacks. Hermione was left standing by the dying fire, her hands still tingling where she had touched his skin. The trust she had felt was replaced by a hollow, aching doubt. He had opened up just for a second, and then he had slammed the door with a violence that left her breathless. The warmth had been a trick of the light, a false truce that left her feeling more alone than she had been in the storm. She looked down at the table, where a single drop of ink had fallen from his quill, staining the parchment like a tear. She realized then that the conflict wasn't just between them. It was the war Draco was fighting within himself, a war between the boy who wanted to be seen and the man who was terrified of what she would find. As she walked back to her quarters, the fog outside seemed to seep through the very stones of the manor. The emotional seesaw had swung back to cold, and this time Hermione wasn't sure if she had the strength to wait for the return of the sun. The sea roared in the distance, a reminder that some things are meant to be broken by the tide, no matter how hard you try to hold them together. The sixth day broke with a sky that looked like curdled milk. The fog had not lifted, it had thickened, becoming a sentient, heavy thing that pressed against the window panes of Blackwood Manor. It was a day of atmospheric pressure, so tangible that the students moved through the corridors like divers submerged in deep water. The Ministry's final field assignment was a survey of the Glimmer Reefs, natural formations of magical salt that appeared only during the lowest nap tide, accessible by a narrow, treacherous land bridge that the sea reclaimed within the hour. Hermione stood at the edge of the cliff, her boots slipping on the slick, lichen-covered stone. Beside her, Draco was a pillar of restrained agitation. He hadn't looked at her since the library. He had returned to his default state of biting frostiness, a repulsion so calculated it felt like a physical wall. He gripped his cane with a white-knuckled intensity, his eyes fixed on the receding waterline with a grim, hollow focus. The enchantment on the reef is volatile, Hermione noted, her voice trembling slightly from the biting wind. It reacts to emotional resonance. We have to keep our focus entirely on the stabilizing charms. Draco gave a short, jagged bark of laughter. Focus. Yes, because that's been our forte this week, hasn't it, Granger? He didn't wait for her response. He began the descent, his movements jerky and uncoordinated on the steep path. Hermione followed, her heart hammered against her ribs. The static between them was no longer a hum. It was a roar, a visceral alignment of their mutual dread. As they reached the reef, the world changed. The salt formations glowed with a pale, sickly, iridescent light, humming with a frequency that made Hermione's teeth ache. The air tasted of ancient copper and ozone. "Start the containment," Draco commanded, his wand already moving in a sharp defensive arc. They worked in a feverish, tense silence. For 30 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the tide and the low mutter of Latin incantations. But the reef was hungry. The magical salt began to pulse in time with the tremor in Draco's hands. Suddenly, a localized surge of magic, a vibration of suppressed grief and salt-choked anger, erupted from the center of the formation. A wave of shimmering, translucent mist swept over them, an enchantment designed to trap the mind in its own most vivid fears. Hermione felt the world tilt. The grey cliffs vanished, replaced by the cold marble floor of Malfoy Manor. She heard the scream of her own voice, felt the bite of the silver knife against her skin. The atmospheric pressure became the weight of Bellatrix's boot on her throat. She couldn't breathe. She was drowning in a memory of salt and blood. "Hermione!" The voice was distant, a rough friction against the nightmare. "Granger, look at me! It's an echo! It's just the salt!" She felt a pair of hands seize her shoulders. The contact was jarring, a visceral alignment that shattered the illusion. She gasped, her lungs burning as the sea air rushed back in. Her vision cleared to find Draco hovering over her, his face a mask of raw, unadulterated terror. He wasn't the aristocrat now. He was a boy who had seen too much death, his grey eyes wide and wet with a moisture that wasn't sea spray. "You're here," he choked out, his grip on her arms so tight it would surely leave marks. "You're at the sea. You're safe. I'm here." he was shaking. The repulsion had vanished, replaced by a desperate, grounding warmth. He pulled her against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Hermione could feel the frantic, uneven thud of his heart against her chest, a rhythmic confession of everything he had tried to hide. "I thought you were going back there," he whispered, his voice breaking into a jagged sob. "I thought I'd lost the only thing that isn't black and white." Hermione reached up, her fingers tangling in the damp, white blonde hair at the nape of his neck. The magnetic pull was absolute. She didn't think about the war, or the trials, or the rot he claimed was in his soul. She only felt the shivering reality of him. "I'm here, Draco," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." He pulled back just enough to look at her. The approach was inevitable now. The seesaw had finally stalled at the peak. His gaze dropped to her lips, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no cold withdrawal. There was only a starving, visceral need. His mouth met hers with a jarring impact that felt like a lightning strike. It wasn't the soft, tentative kiss of a storybook. It was a battle. It tasted of salt, mint, and desperation. It was the collision of two people who had been pushed to the very edge of their endurance and had finally decided to jump. Draco's hands moved from her shoulders to her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a frantic, possessive intensity. He kissed her as if he were trying to breathe her in, as if she were the only antidote to the poison in his veins. Hermione leaned into him, her hands clutching at the front of his damp shirt, her mind a swirl of "can't help but think" and "never let go." The world around them was dissolving. The tide was coming in, the water beginning to swirl around their ankles, but neither of them moved. The warmth was a conflagration, a fire that defied the freezing Cornish mist. "Deserve, Hermione," he whispered. "The deserve, Hermione," he whispered, the cold of his guilt trying to claw its way back. "I'm a ruin. You're building a world, and I'm just the rubble left behind." "Then let me be the one to decide what I deserve," she countered, her voice fierce and unyielding. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the silver ring cold against her skin. "The tide is coming in, Draco. We have to go." He looked at their joined hands, his expression a turbulent mix of hope and agony. For a moment, the betrayal of his own self-loathing threatened to pull him back into the shadows. But then he squeezed her hand back, a firm, grounding pressure. "The bridge is almost gone," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its strength. "Run, Granger." They scrambled back across the land bridge just as the first major wave crashed over the stones, erasing the path behind them. They stood at the base of the cliffs, drenched and shivering, their breath blooming in the grey air. The trust between them was no longer a fragile thing. It was a pact signed in salt and a desperate shared breath. As they began the long climb back to the manor, Draco didn't let go of her hand. He walked beside her, his limp heavy, his posture weary, but for the first time, the atmospheric pressure felt like something they could carry together. The manor loomed above them, a skeletal grey sentinel in the fog. Inside, the social friction of the other students awaited them, the scrutiny of the ministry and the cold reality of their divergent paths. But as Hermione looked at Draco, she saw the first threshold had been crossed. The war wasn't over. The war inside him might never be. But the silence was finally broken. They reached the heavy oak doors, and before they stepped back into the world of rules and expectations, Draco stopped. He turned her toward him, his eyes searching hers one last time. "Tomorrow," he said, the word a promise and a plea. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The seventh night at Blackwood Manor was carved from velvet and ice. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a crystalline chill that turned the sea mist into a fine, stinging frost upon the window panes. Inside the library, the fire had dwindled to a pulsing bed of embers, casting a bruised crimson glow over the spines of ancient books. The atmospheric pressure had shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of a coming gale, but the taut, vibrating pull of a bowstring drawn to its limit. Hermione sat on the floor by the hearth, her back against the damp stone. She was ostensibly reviewing the final draft of their maritime magic thesis, but the ink blurred before her eyes. Every sense was tuned to the shadow sitting just inches away. Draco was leaning against the opposite side of the hearth, his long legs stretched out, his gaze fixed on the dying flames. Since the Reef, since the jarring impact of that first desperate kiss, a new kind of silence had settled between them. It wasn't the jagged defensive silence of enemies, but a dense, tactile quiet, a shared breath held in the dark. "You're thinking too loud, Granger," Draco murmured. His voice was a low friction against the stillness, stripped of its aristocratic armor. "I'm not thinking," she lied, her fingers tracing the rough tooth of the parchment. "I'm proofreading." "Liar." He turned his head, the firelight catching the sharp silver line of his jaw. "You're cataloguing. You're trying to find a shelf for what happened on the Reef. You're looking for a logical explanation for why you haven't run screaming back to the safety of Potter's shadow." Hermione finally set the parchment aside. The magnetic pull was so intense, it felt like a physical ache in her chest. "There is no logical explanation for you, Draco. There never has been. You're a series of contradictions wrapped in a very expensive cloak." He let out a short, huffed breath that might have been a laugh. He moved then, sliding down from his perch to join her on the rug. The movement was slow, a deliberate approach that made the air between them hum with static. As he settled beside her, the scent of mint and the cold, sharp ozone of the sea enveloped her. Their shoulders brushed, a light, lingering friction that sent a rhythmic tremor through her frame. "I'm a wreck," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He held up his hand, the silver ring catching the ember's light. His fingers were trembling, a faint, persistent vibration of raw nerves. "I wake up, and the first thing I feel is the weight of everyone I let down, every choice I didn't make. And then I see you, and for a second the weight vanishes. It's terrifying." Hermione reached out, her hand hovering before she finally gathered the courage to touch him. She didn't take his hand. Instead, she let her fingertips graze the pulse point at his wrist. His skin was hot, his blood drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against her touch. "Maybe it's not vanishing," she whispered, leaning closer until their breath mingled in the frigid air. "Maybe you're just finally sharing the load." Draco's eyes searched hers, the grey depths turbulent and dark. The "can't help but think" had become a visceral alignment of their needs. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a reverence that made her heart stutter. The touch was light, almost a question, before it hardened into a command. He pulled her toward him, his hand tangling in the thick curls at the back of her head. This time, the kiss was different. It wasn't the desperate, salt-choked collision of the reef. It was slow, agonizingly desired, a long, thirsting surrender. It tasted of the wine they had shared at dinner and the wood smoke of the fire. His mouth was soft yet demanding, a velvet pressure that seemed to strip away her last remaining defenses. Hermione let out a small, broken sound, her hands finding the lapels of his sweater, pulling him flush against her. The warmth was absolute now, a conflagration that pushed back the shadows of the library. She could feel the bite of his silver ring against the nape of her neck, the solid, grounding weight of him pinning her against the reality of the moment. He moved his lips to the sensitive skin just below her ear, his breath a warm contrast to the freezing room. "I shouldn't want this," he groaned against her skin, his voice thick with a self-loathing that refused to die. "I'm going to ruin you, Hermione. I'm going to drag you into the dark with me." "Then I'll bring a light," she whispered, her fingers tightening on his shoulders. She pulled him back to her, her lips seeking his with a fierce, intelligent hunger. She wanted to drown out his doubts with the sheer, vibrating intensity of her presence. The tactile friction of their clothes, the heat of their skin, the hollow echo of their breathing in the vast, empty room. It all coalesced into a singular point of focus. For the first time in years, the war was a distant memory, a ghost that couldn't cross the threshold of their shared heat. Draco's hands were no longer shaking. They were sure and possessive as they slid down her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the thick wool of her robes. He kissed her until her lungs burned, until the only thing she knew was the taste of him and the rhythmic thud of the sea against the cliffs far below. The seesaw had finally found its equilibrium. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a magnetic pull so strong it felt like gravity itself. They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together in the dying firelight. Eventually, Draco pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were clear, the haunted shadow temporarily retreated. He looked at her, not as a Gryffindor saint or a ministry pet, but as a woman who had seen his worst and stayed anyway. "We have to leave tomorrow," he said, the reality of the world outside the manor beginning to seep back in. The train back to London, the stairs, the whispers. "Let them whisper," Hermione replied, her voice firm. She reached up and smoothed a stray lock of white blonde hair from his forehead. "They've been whispering about us for years, Draco. We might as well give them something real to talk about." He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched in a way that felt like a victory. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the silver ring pressing into her palm. The trust was a heavy, solid thing between them now, a foundation built on the very wreckage he so feared. As the final embers of the fire turned to grey ash, plunging the library into a soft blue twilight, Hermione realized that the maritime magic they had been studying was nothing compared to the alchemy of two broken people finding a way to fit together. The salt hadn't ground them down. It had preserved the parts of them that were still capable of feeling. The sea roared one last time, a distant, fading thunder. Inside the manor, the silence was finally peaceful. They didn't speak of the future, or the trials, or the names they would be called. They simply sat in the dark, two shadows becoming one, waiting for the first light of the final day to break over the horizon. The final morning at Blackwood Manor arrived with a clarity that was almost violent. The fog had been scoured away by a sharp northern wind, leaving the Atlantic a brilliant, mocking shade of sapphire. The grey stone of the manor, which had seemed so oppressive for a week, now stood stark and skeletal against a sky that offered no shadows to hide in. Hermione stood in the great hall, her trunk packed and waiting by the heavy oak doors. The atmospheric pressure of the retreat had dissipated, replaced by the hollow, ringing silence of a house being emptied of its ghosts. She adjusted the strap of her satchel, her fingers lingering on the wool of her sleeve. The rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner felt like a countdown. In less than an hour, the carriages would return to take them back to the station, back to the social friction of a world that demanded they remain on opposite sides of a line drawn in blood. Checking for missed references one last time, Granger. The voice was a low rasp, a familiar friction that made her pulse leap against her throat before she even turned. Draco was standing at the foot of the spiral staircase. He was dressed in his travelling robes, black and severe, but the rigid mask he had worn on the journey down was gone. In its place was something more fragile, a raw, exposed exhaustion that made him look human. "I think we've documented every grain of salt in Cornwall," Hermione replied, her voice steady despite the sudden tremor in her chest. He walked toward her, his limp a rhythmic thud against the flagstones. As he stopped in front of her, the magnetic pull she had fought since the first carriage ride returned with a suffocating intensity. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his grey eyes tracing the line of her brow, the curve of her jaw, as if he were memorizing a map of a country he was about to be exiled from. "They're waiting outside," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "Potter and the rest? The righteous?" "They aren't waiting for me to be someone else, Draco," she said softly. "They're just waiting for me." "And what am I waiting for?" He took a step closer, the scent of mint and the cold, lingering ozone of the library enveloping her. He reached out, his hand hovering before his fingers finally brushed against the back of her hand. The tactile friction was no longer a shock. It was a grounding force, a visceral alignment of their two fractured realities. "I'm going back to a manor that feels like a tomb, to a name that people spit on the street. I'm going back to being the shadow you accidentally stepped into." Hermione reached up, her palm coming to rest against his cheek. His skin was cold from the morning air, but the heat beneath it was a conflagration. "You aren't a shadow," she whispered, "and I didn't step into you by accident. I chose to stay." The seesaw of the week, the approach, the repulsion, the warmth, the biting cold, all led to this final, agonizingly quiet threshold. Draco leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a heartbeat as he let out a jagged, broken breath. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice thick with the internal guilt that still threatened to pull him under. "I don't know how to be the person who deserves a seat at your table." "Then don't be that person yet," she countered. "Just be the person who doesn't run away." The sound of the carriage wheels grinding against the gravel outside echoed through the hall. The time for words was ending. Draco's hand moved from her hand to her waist, pulling her flush against him with a sudden, possessive intensity. The "can't help but think" had become a "can't let go." He kissed her then, a final, visceral surrender that tasted of salt and the promise of a future they hadn't yet earned. It wasn't the desperate battle of the Reef or the slow exploration of the library. It was a seal, a pact signed in the shivering light of a new day. His mouth was firm and demanding, a velvet pressure that seemed to anchor her to the very stones of the earth. Hermione clung to him, her fingers tangling in the fine white blonde hair at the nape of his neck, her heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic defiance against the world waiting outside. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers. His breath was shallow, his eyes wide and clear. "I'll write," he whispered, the words sounding like a vow. "Not as a Malfoy, not as a ghost, just as me." "I'll be waiting for the owl," she replied, her voice breaking. The doors swung open, flooding the hall with a blinding sapphire light. Harry and Ron were there, their silhouettes dark against the sun, calling her name. The first threshold of the real world was calling. Draco straightened his spine, the aristocratic mask flickering for a second before he solidified it. He stepped back, the repulsion of their social roles demanding its due. But as he turned to gather his cane, his fingers brushed hers one last time. A lingering, secret friction that promised everything the world said they couldn't have. Hermione walked out into the light, the salt air stinging her eyes. She felt the weight of her friends' gazes, the questions they hadn't yet asked, and the crushing expectation of being the girl who always knew the answer. But as she climbed into the carriage and looked back at the skeletal remains of Blackwood Manor, she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the doorway. Draco didn't wave. He didn't move. He simply stood there, a pale, sharp silhouette against the grey stone. But the silver ring on his finger caught the sun, a tiny, brilliant spark in the gloom. The carriage began to move, the wheels turning against the salt-crusted road. Hermione sat back, her hands folded in her lap, her fingers still tingling from the heat of his skin. The internal monologue of her doubts was quiet for the first time in years. She didn't know if they would survive the scrutiny of London, or if the rot in his foundations would ever truly heal. But as the manor vanished behind a bend in the cliff, Hermione looked at the sea, the vast, relentless Atlantic that ground even the hardest stones into sand. She realized that the salt hadn't just preserved them, it had cleansed them. The war was over, the retreat was finished, and for the first time, the first threshold didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. She closed her eyes and listened to the rhythmic sound of the waves retreating, a sound that no longer promised drowning, but the slow, steady certainty of the tide coming back in. The return to Hogwarts was not the homecoming Hermione had imagined. The castle, usually a sanctuary of amber light and familiar enchantments, felt suffocatingly small after the vast, salt-scoured horizons of the coast. The atmospheric pressure of the great hall was thick with a different kind of static, not the raw elemental charge of the sea, but the jagged, judgmental friction of several hundred teenagers armed with memories of a war that refused to stay buried. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, the tooth of her old parchment catching under her quill as she tried to focus on a transfiguration essay. Every time the heavy oak doors groaned open, her breath hitched, a traitorous physical alignment with a shadow that hadn't yet appeared. Across from her, Ron was mid-sentence, his voice a low, insistent hum of suspicion. "He's been avoiding everyone since the retreat, Hermione. Harry says he saw him in the owlery at 3 a.m, probably plotting how to get his family's vaults unfrozen." "Maybe he's just tired, Ron," Hermione said, her voice clipped. She tightened her grip on her quill until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. The research was exhausting. The magic at the manor was heavy. Heavy. It was Malfoy. He's a lead weight on everything he touches. The repulsion of the public eye was a cold, physical wall. When Draco finally entered the hall, he didn't look toward the Gryffindor table. He walked with a rigid, aristocratic distance, his spine a straight line of pure defiance. His limp was less pronounced, but the silver head of his cane clicked against the stone floor with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that echoed through the sudden hush of the room. He sat at the very end of the Slytherin table, a solitary island in a sea of green and silver. He didn't eat. He simply stared at a point on the far wall, his hands folded neatly in his lap, the silver ring on his finger reflecting the flickering candlelight like a cold, distant star. The magnetic pull was agonizing. Hermione felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her sleeves until the thread nearly snapped. She wanted to stand up, to walk across the divide, to press her hand against the hollow of his cheek and remind him of the warmth they had shared in the library. But the weight of 1,000 eyes held her pinned to the bench. The week passed in a blur of strained silences and visceral misalignments. They passed each other in the corridors like ghosts, their robes brushing for a fraction of a second. A brief electric friction that sent a tremor through Hermione's frame, before they were pulled apart by the flow of students. Draco's eyes were always fixed forward, his expression a mask of cooling ash, yet she saw the way his jaw tightened whenever she was near. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in the restricted section. Hermione was hunting for a volume on non-linear arithmancy when she felt the static in the air change. The scent of mint and the sharp metallic tang of ozone preceded him. She turned to find him standing in the shadows of the stacks, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight filtering through the high windows. He looked haggard, the hollows beneath his cheekbones deeper than they had been at the sea. "Granger," he whispered, the name a low friction against the silence. "You haven't spoken to me in 6 days, Draco," she said, her voice trembling with a righteous, aching fury. "You haven't even looked at me. Was the pier a lie? Was the reef just maritime magic?" He stepped into the sliver of moonlight, and the warmth she had been starving for returned with the force of a tidal wave. He didn't apologize. Instead, he reached out and seized her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers with a desperate white-knuckle intensity. "I thought if I stayed away, the rot wouldn't spread," he choked out, his voice stripped of its armor. "I thought if I played the villain again, they'd leave you alone. But I can't breathe in this building, Hermione. Every time I see you across that hall, it feels like the tide is coming in and I'm chained to the rocks." The internal monologue of her doubts vanished. She stepped into his space, her forehead coming to rest against his. The visceral alignment was absolute. She could feel the frantic, uneven thud of his heart, a rhythmic confession that matched her own. "We aren't at the Manor anymore," she whispered, her hands finding the heavy wool of his robes. "There are no wards to hold us back, Draco, only the ones we build for ourselves." He let out a jagged, broken breath and pulled her into a kiss that was both a battle and a homecoming. It wasn't slow or desired. It was a collision. It tasted of ink, old paper, and a desperate, starving need. He kissed her as if she were the only thing keeping him from dissolving into the shadows of the library. The seesaw had swung back to warmth, but this time the heat was different. It was solid. It was a foundation. "They're going to hate this," Draco murmured against her lips, his breath warm against her skin. "They're going to look at you and see a traitor." "Let them look," Hermione replied, her voice fierce and unyielding. She reached up and traced the line of his jaw, her thumb lingering on the silver stubble. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected. I think it's time I did what was necessary." They stayed in the shadows of the books for a long time, the silence of the library no longer heavy, but protective. The social friction of the great halls still waited for them tomorrow, but as Draco gripped her hand, the silver ring pressing into her palm, Hermione knew the rot was gone. They weren't ghosts of the war anymore. They were two people who had found a way to breathe in a world made of salt. The grandfather clock in the corridor chimed midnight, the sound a distant, fading thunder. Hermione leaned into him, her mind clear, her heart steady. The first threshold of their new reality was behind them, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the fall. The transition from the shadowed intimacy of the library to the stark, biting reality of Hogsmeade was a jagged impact. It was the first weekend of December, and the village was a study in monochromatic contrast. Pristine white snow against the charcoal skeletons of the trees. Hermione walked beside Harry and Ron, her breath blooming in the frozen air, but her mind was a constant, rhythmic oscillation toward the figure she knew was trailing them at a distance. Draco was there, a sharp silhouette in a heavy black greatcoat, his silver-headed cane sinking into the fresh powder with every step. He didn't approach. He stayed exactly 20 paces behind, a silent sentinel in the periphery. The atmospheric pressure was mounting. Every time Ron looked back and narrowed his eyes, the static in the air thickened. "He's like a vulture," Ron muttered, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his wand through his pocket. "Just waiting for someone to trip." "He's just walking, Ron," Hermione said, her voice tight. She felt a frantic need to straighten her scarf, her fingers fumbling with the wool. The "can't help but think" was a physical ache in her chest, a magnetic pull that made every step away from Draco feel like a betrayal. They reached the clearing near the 3 broomsticks when the repulsion of the student body finally erupted. A group of 7th-year boys, mostly those who had lost family in the final battle, stepped into Draco's path. The air suddenly tasted of ozone and old, bitter grievances. "Lost your way, Malfoy," one of them spat, a tall boy with a jagged scar across his chin. "The path to the dungeons is back that way. Or maybe you're looking for another mark to hide under that expensive sleeve." Draco stopped. He didn't recoil, but his posture went unnervingly rigid, a pillar of cold, concentrated defiance. He didn't raise his wand. He simply stood there, the wind whipping his pale hair across his face, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond their shoulders. "I am going to the bookshop," Draco said, his voice a low mechanical rasp. "Move." "Or what? You'll call your father." "Oh, wait." The laughter that followed was a visceral alignment of spite. They closed in, their shadows lengthening over the snow. Hermione felt a sudden, violent surge of protective heat. She didn't think about the social friction or the names they would call her. She simply moved. She stepped out from between Harry and Ron, her boots crunching loudly on the ice as she pushed through the crowd. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of Draco, her back to him, her chin tilted up in a gesture of pure, unadulterated Gryffindor steel. "That's enough," she commanded. Her voice didn't shake. It was the voice of the girl who had stared down a Dark Lord, and it carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "Granger, what are you doing?" the boy with the scar asked, his wand wavering. "He's a Death Eater. He doesn't belong here." "He belongs wherever he chooses to stand," Hermione countered, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "If you have a problem with him, you have a problem with me. And I suggest you remember exactly who you're speaking to before you take another step." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the distant sea magic still echoing in her memory. Behind her, she heard a sharp, hitching breath. She felt Draco move, not to flee, but to step closer. His hand reached out, his fingers brushing the wool of her cloak in a tentative, grounding friction. The seesaw tipped. The crowd began to disperse, muttering about traitors and lost causes. But Hermione didn't care. She turned to face Draco. His face was a mask of shattered pride and raw, vibrating vulnerability. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't believe in. The internal guilt that had been his anchor for months seemed to fracture in the light of her public loyalty. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Now they'll look at you the way they look at me." "Let them," she replied, her voice fierce. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in the middle of the crowded street. The silver ring was a cold bite against her skin, but his grip was a conflagration. They walked away from the village, toward the skeletal remains of the shrieking shack, where the shadows were long and deep. Under the eaves of the old, groaning house, the trust between them solidified into something unbreakable. Draco pulled her into the darkness of the porch, his hands finding her face with a frantic, trembling intensity. "I thought I'd lost the right to be seen," he groaned against her hair. "I thought the rot had taken everything." "It didn't take me," she whispered. He kissed her then, not a battle, but a surrender. It was a slow, deep alignment of their histories, a kiss that tasted of winter air and the promise of a spring they would build together. The tactile friction of his coat against hers, the heat of his breath, the solid, grounding weight of his body against the wood. It was a resolution of every conflict they had endured. The emotional seesaw had finally stopped. As they stood in the freezing afternoon, their hands joined and their hearts finally in sync, Hermione realized that the war wasn't something they had to survive anymore. It was something they had outgrown. The 11th day was not an ending, but a graduation into a world that finally had room for their silence. The stone corridors of Hogwarts had been traded for the sun-bleached wood of a small, non-magical pier on the edge of a sleeping coastal town. Here, the Atlantic did not roar with the skeletal haunting of Blackwood Manor. It hummed, a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt less like a threat and more like a lullaby. Hermione stood at the railing, her hair no longer whipped into a frantic mess by a storm, but teased gently by a breeze that tasted of salt and summer gorse. She looked down at her hands, resting on the silvered timber. There was no tactile friction of nervous habits anymore. Her fingers were still, her posture open, the atmospheric pressure of the war having finally evaporated into the clear blue sky. "The train leaves in an hour," a voice murmured behind her. It was a low, melodic friction, no longer raspy with the weight of unsaid apologies. Draco stepped up beside her. He had traded his heavy black travelling robes for a simple linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were no longer tense with internal guilt. The dark mark was still there, a faded grey ghost of a life he had outgrown, but it no longer seemed to pulse with the rot he had once feared. He looked out at the horizon, his grey eyes clear, reflecting the brilliant sapphire of the water. "Are you sure, Hermione?" he asked, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "The ministry, the prophet. They won't stop looking for the crack in the foundation." "Let them look," she replied, turning to face him. The magnetic pull between them was no longer a frantic, starving thing. It was a constant, grounding heat. "They're looking for a tragedy, Draco. They don't know how to categorize a transformation." She reached out, her fingers grazing the silver ring on his hand before interlacing with his. The visceral alignment was absolute. There was no more seesaw, no more oscillation between warmth and cold. They had reached the equilibrium they had fought for in the mud and the mist. Draco's grip tightened, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles with a slow, possessive reverence. He looked at her, not as a Gryffindor saint who had saved him, but as the woman who had dared to see him. The "can't help but think" had been replaced by a quiet, immovable certainty. "I spent so long waiting to drown," he whispered, leaning in until their foreheads touched. "I didn't realize I could just walk out of the water." "You didn't walk out alone," she reminded him. The approach was slow, a deliberate crossing of the final threshold. When his mouth met hers, it wasn't a collision born of trauma or a desperate grab for life. It was a happy, lingering surrender. It tasted of the sea, of freedom, and of the many tomorrows they had finally secured. It was a kiss that held the weight of every repulsion they had overcome and every trust they had rebuilt. The tactile friction of his skin against hers, the solid weight of his hands on her waist, the rhythmic sound of their shared breath. It was the final resolution of their story. The conflict wasn't just settled, it was transformed into a new architecture. As they walked back toward the town, their shadows stretching long and joined across the golden sand, the internal monologue of their fears was finally silent. They weren't the Golden Girl and the Malfoy heir. They were simply two people who had survived the storm and discovered that the salt hadn't ruined them. It had made them permanent. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. Behind them, the pier stood silent, a witness to the moment the ghosts finally stopped haunting the shore. Ahead of them, lay a world without lines, without marks, and without the heavy pressure of the past. Hermione squeezed his hand, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need to know what came next. She only needed to know that they were walking toward it together. The decade that followed the salt breeze of Cornwall did not pass in a blur. It settled year by year like fine silt at the bottom of a clear lake. 10 years later, the atmospheric pressure of the wizarding world had finally equalized. The screaming headlines had faded into yellowed archives, and the names Malfoy and Granger were no longer a collision of scandals, but a quiet, solid hyphenation in the registry of a life built far from the marble cold of the past. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Hermione stood in the kitchen of their home, a restored cottage perched on a cliffside not far from where their story had truly begun. The house was a living organism of books, dried herbs, and the soft, chaotic energy of a life lived in the light. She was levitating a heavy iron pot, her wand movements precise and practiced. Yet, even after 10 years, her fingers still fluttered to the edge of her sleeve to straighten a cuff that wasn't there. It was a phantom limb of her old anxiety, a ghost of the girl who had once been terrified of the dark. "The resonance is off, Granger. You're overthinking the rosemary again." The voice was a low melodic friction that vibrated against her spine. Hermione didn't need to turn to know he was there. Draco had entered the room with the silent, rhythmic grace of a shadow that had finally found its place in the sun. She felt the magnetic pull as he moved behind her. He didn't reach for her immediately. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his presence a grounding force that pulled the static out of the air. He was 30 now, his features having lost the jagged, skeletal sharpness of his youth. The hollows beneath his cheekbones had filled in, and the silver stubble on his jaw was a sign of a man who no longer felt the need to wear a mask of perfection. "I am not overthinking it," she said, finally turning to face him. "I am ensuring the structural integrity of the stew." Draco let out a short, huffed breath, a real laugh, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. He reached out, his long fingers grazing the pulse point at her wrist. The tactile friction was no longer a shock of electricity. It was a warm, constant hum of shared history. "You're using logic to cook, Hermione. Some things require a visceral alignment of the senses. Move over." He took the wooden spoon from her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers for a lingering second. The silver ring on his finger was still there, but it was joined by a simple gold band that matched the one on her own hand. The internal guilt that had once made his hand shake was a distant memory, replaced by a steady, quiet strength. He stirred the pot with a practiced ease, his focus entirely on the steam rising from the iron. Hermione watched him, her mind drifting back to the first time she had seen him at the library at Blackwood Manor. Then, he had been a boy made of glass and spite. Now, he was the man who knew exactly how she liked her tea and which books she reached for when the nightmares of the war returned. "The children are quiet," she noted, leaning her hip against the counter. "Too quiet." "Scorpius is showing Rose the lunar charts we made during the retreat," Draco murmured, not looking up. "He inherited your stubborn need to categorize the stars. She inherited my ability to tell him he's doing it wrong. The emotional seesaw of their early years had finally found its equilibrium. There were no more days of biting frost or sudden withdrawals. The warmth was absolute, a fire that they fed together every single day. Draco set the spoon down and turned to her. The proximity was still a physical weight, an atmospheric pressure of love that made her heart stutter in the best way. He reached out and tucked a stray, wild curl behind her ear, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that hadn't faded in a decade. 10 years, Hermione, he whispered, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rasp. Sometimes I still wait for the tide to go out and take it all away. The tide only goes out so it can come back in, Draco, she replied, her hand coming to rest over the faded grey mark on his forearm, a mark that no longer held any power over him. We aren't standing on the pier anymore. We built the house on the rock. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The can't help but think had long ago become a can't live without. He kissed her then, a slow, deep surrender that tasted of home and the promise of 1,000 more Tuesdays. It was a kiss that held the memory of the salt spray, the fear of the reef, and the triumph of the first threshold. The internal monologue of her life was no longer a series of questions and doubts. It was a single, steady word. Us. The sound of footsteps thundering down the stairs, a rhythmic, chaotic impact of 2 sets of feet, shattered the silence. Dad, Rose says the drowned glass doesn't actually glow without a moon charm. Draco pulled back just an inch, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the old Malfoy smirk, but softened by a decade of peace. Go tell your sister she's technically correct, which is the most annoying kind of correct. He looked back at Hermione, his grey eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with choice. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the gold and silver rings pressing together in a visceral alignment of their 2 worlds. Dinner first, he said, his voice firm and happy. Then we'll teach them how to handle the salt. As they sat down at the heavy oak table, the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and gold. Outside, the Atlantic hummed against the cliffs, a distant, fading thunder that no longer promised drowning. The first threshold was a lifetime ago. They were no longer the ghosts of a war or the wreckage of a house. They were the architects of a new world, one where the silence wasn't a weapon, but a sanctuary. Hermione looked at the man across from her and the children at the table, and for the first time in her life, the logic was simple. The salt hadn't ground them down. It had preserved the only thing that mattered. The tide was in, and they were finally, truly home.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story was not just about magic, it was about 2 broken people. It was about the fear of being seen. Draco and Hermione live in a world of black and white, but the sea is grey. Love is often grey, too. Sometimes we think our past defines us. We think our mistakes are like salt, burning and permanent. But as we saw at the Manor, salt can also preserve. It can make us stronger. I wanted to show that even a monster wants to be loved, and even a hero wants to be understood. Moving from hate to love is not just a straight line. It is a storm. It is a slow dance in the dark. I hope this story reminded you of something important. You are not your scars. You are the light you choose to follow. Thank you for listening until the next time.